It was a warm, cloudless Thursday afternoon in downtown Atlanta, the kind that made the heat rise off the pavement like waves, distorting everything above its hand as Darren Cole navigated the familiar grid of streets in his black Chevy Tahoe. He barely noticed the chaos of the city around him, his mind still occupied by the intense debriefing he'd just left with the State Counterterrorism Task Force. Tall, sharp, and always precise, Darren carried himself with quiet authority. His tailored charcoal blazer hung neatly from his shoulders, and the subtle Homeland Security pin on his lapel was the only hint of the position he held. Senior agent in charge of threat response and interagency cooperation, he was respected in federal circles not just for his tactical brilliance, but for his calm leadership in crisis. The man called in when things got messy, but none of that mattered now. Not to the two young officers who began tailing him near Peachtree Street, their squad car creeping behind his at every stop, their eyes clearly locked on the silhouette of a well-dressed black man behind the wheel of a high-end vehicle. Darren noticed them immediately. Years of surveillance and fieldwork had honed his instincts. He could feel attention like Waytand. Sure enough, at the next light, their lights flashed. He pulled over quickly, calm, unbothered, hands at 10 and 2, knowing that, despite the inconvenience, this was part of the world he lived in. What he didn't expect was how quickly the stop escalated. The officers approached from both sides, hands hovering near weapons, voices clipped with suspicion. "License and registration," barked the first, barely looking at Darren, who responded with patience, his ID already in hand. "Where are you coming from? What's in the back? This your vehicle?" The questions weren't just redundant, they were loaded. Darren answered each one clearly, keeping his voice even. But when he casually mentioned he had just left a meeting at the State Fusion Center, the younger officer squinted. "Fusion Center? What's that?" Darren didn't respond with sarcasm. He simply said, "It's where your captain sends intel." That irritated them. They asked him to step out of the car. He politely declined, asking what the probable cause was. That's when one officer muttered something about the SUV matching a vehicle recently flagged as possibly stolen. Darren raised an eyebrow. "Possibly?" he repeated, reaching slowly to begin recording with his phone. They weren't amused. They called for a tow truck. Darren sat silently, still calm now with his phone clearly recording, identifying badge numbers. Under his breath, "Gentlemen," he said once, softly, "I suggest you double-check your system before this goes further." They didn't. They opened his back door without permission. One officer rifled through his briefcase, unaware that it contained redacted materials marked for federal distribution only. Darren's face didn't change. He simply asked again, "Are you certain you want to proceed with this search?" Their arrogance kept them from hearing the warning. They radioed in to impound the vehicle. One of them smirked, saying, "You can pick it up in 48 hours, if it checks out." Darren exhaled slowly, then reached into his coat not defensively and pulled out a dark leather wallet, unfolding it slowly. Inside gleamed his gold Homeland Security badge, and next to it, his federal ID with a Level 5 clearance. His name printed in bold beneath the title department of Homeland Security, Counterterrorism Division. The smirk dropped. The younger, "OFICER," stammered. "I didn't realize," Darren cut him off gently. "That's exactly the problem." The tow truck, still en route, was canceled. The officer who had touched his briefcase backed away like it was radioactive. "You're going to want to call your captain," Darren said, "and while you're at it, inform your internal affairs liaison that this stop was recorded in full." The silence was sudden, awkward, thick with consequence. What had begun as a routine abuse of power had turned into a career-altering mistake. Darren didn't yell. He didn't threaten. He simply stood there, composed, watching as both officers scrambled to backtrack. "You were driving a nice car, dressed in a suit, ... We thought you thought wrong," Darren said, "and that's going in the report." By the time he drove away in his own vehicle, of course the precinct was already buzzing. He'd seen this playbook before. He knew the code words, the subtle shifts, the language of suspicion disguised as procedure. But this time had a badge of his own, and this time he wasn't letting it slide. As Darren Cole stood silently watching the officer's expressions morph from confident condescension to outright horror, The only sound between them was the distant hum of the tow truck turning off its engine mid-roll, confused by a sudden radio order to stand down. The air around them, once crackling with the false authority of men, assuming power by presence alone, now felt hollow, stripped bare by the undeniable authority carried in the small leather wallet Darren had revealed his federal Homeland Security credentials, engraved badge, and laminated ID, confirming not only his identity, but his position as Special Agent in charge of counterterrorism, a title that instantly rendered every smug smirk, every assumption, every violation of civil rights, in the last 15 minutes into a career-ending error in judgment. The officer, nearest to Darren, backed away a half-step, blinking rapidly as if trying to wake from a bad dream, while his partner, still near the rear of the SUV, muttered something unintelligible into his radio, voice trembling as the gravity of their mistake settled into his gut like ice. Darren, never once raising his voice, said calmly, "You've illegally searched a federal agent's vehicle, violated interagency protocol, and made false accusations without probable cause. Everything you've done is on record." He gestured once to the phone mounted discreetly on his dashboard, which had been recording the stop from the moment the lights had flashed behind him. The senior officer, suddenly stripped of the false confidence he'd worn like a second uniform, began to protest, "Sir, we didn't realize who you were." But Darren held up one hand, not as a threat, but as an assertion of silence, a reminder that authority doesn't need volume to be felt. "You didn't ask who I was," he said, "because you thought you already knew. That's the problem." By now, dispatch had confirmed his credentials, and voices crackled over their radios with a kind of anxious urgency that only occurs when someone important is watching. A supervisor's voice came through next tight, clipped, and immediately deferential. "Please ask Agent Cole to remain at the scene. Captain Warren is en route." Darren gave no indication that he'd comply, nor did he move toward his car just yet. Instead, he turned his full attention on the officers who had moments ago ordered him out of his own vehicle, watched them with eyes not of vengeance, but of documentation, like a prosecutor taking mental notes. The tow truck driver, standing awkwardly to the side, now avoided eye contact entirely, clearly unsure if he was part of a legal disaster or just an unfortunate witness. When the marked patrol SUV of Captain Warren arrived, lights off, but urgency written across its acceleration, the captain exited fast, head down, tie loose, approaching Darren with hands slightly raised, an instinctive sign of de-escalation, of submission even, recognizing instantly the hierarchy at play. "Agent Cole," he began, tone respectful and serious, "I deeply regret what's occurred here. This shouldn't have happened. I'd like to talk." Darren didn't let him finish. "Save it for internal affairs," he said, his tone still composed but firm. "Everything's recorded. I'll be filing my report by end of day with both DHS and your city's Office of Civil Oversight." He paused, eyes narrowed. "And unless you want this incident to go federal, I suggest you prepare your department for a formal review." The captain nodded quickly, clearly understanding the implications. Darren wasn't just a field agent, he was a policymaker, the kind who sat in briefings with senators, the kind who signed off on interagency surveillance authorizations and counter-extremist task force protocols. He was the kind of man whose professional circle had no room for mediocrity or misconduct, especially not the type rooted in racial bias and lazy profiling. Yet what stunned everyone present, more than the badge, more than the titles, more than even the threat of internal investigation, was Darren's restraint. He wasn't yelling, he wasn't gesturing wildly, he wasn't calling the press. His entire body language said, "I don't need to shout because the truth already shouts loud enough." Once released from the entanglement, Darren stepped back into his SUV untouched, still meticulous inside, and closed the door slowly. Looking at the reflection of the officers in the rearview mirror, he didn't speak again, he didn't need to. As he pulled off, not one of the uniformed men moved. They just stood there, surrounded by flashing lights, radio noise, and the sudden echo of their own shame. But Darren's mind wasn't done with them. He was already thinking several steps ahead. He knew how internal politics worked, how reports could be buried or sanitized unless someone with real authority applied pressure. He knew from experience that silence was complicity, and that systemic racism didn't always come in the form of slurs or violence of fan. It came cloaked in standard procedure, wrapped in legal gray areas, and rationalized away as an honest mistake. But mistakes made under the influence of bias were never honest. He arrived at his apartment later that night, connected his dashcam and phone recordings to a secure server, and began assembling his case. Timestamps, badge numbers, procedural breakdowns, all cataloged with the meticulousness of a federal investigator. He knew the strength of his case wasn't just in his badge, it was in the narrative that would follow. The undeniable fact that even a man with top-level clearance wasn't safe from being profiled and dismissed in the very country he swore to protect. The irony wasn't lost on him. He had spent the last 2 decades keeping America safe from threats foreign and domestic, and yet, on a regular Thursday afternoon, the threat had come not from extremists, not from cyber or radical actors, but from the uniforms that claimed to protect citizens like him. The next day, his email to the Internal Affairs Office and Federal Civil Liberties Division was short but firm, attaching both video evidence and a summary of violations. He copied the Office of the Inspector General, his own agency's ethics, counsel, and even the local mayor's liaison office. He didn't want apologies, he wanted accountability. And he knew that when the story broke, it inevitably would. The question wouldn't be whether Darren Cole was a credible source. It would be why no one stopped this sort of abuse until someone with federal power was on the receiving end. He didn't sleep much that night, not from anger, but from purpose, because Darren knew this wasn't just his battle, it was the battle of every young black man pulled over for driving while black, every woman intimidated by the weight of a badge misused, every child growing up knowing that respect has to be earned. Shade. And as he lay awake, files uploading, evidence compiling, he resolved that this time it wouldn't be quietly resolved behind a desk. This time the system was going to face itself in the mirror, and Darren was going to be the one holding it up. The morning sun had barely cut through the blinds of Darren Cole's downtown apartment when he sat down at his laptop with black coffee in one hand and the weight of a nation's broken trust in the other, the previous day's events playing over in his mind, not as personal offense, but as undeniable proof that the system he had long defended was still deeply infected with bias. And this time the evidence wasn't hearsay or speculation, it was high definition, time-stamped, geolocated, and tied directly to one of the highest-ranking Homeland Security agents in the southeastern U.S., a man who had authored interagency protocols, briefed Senate committees, and consulted on national policing reform. And yet, in the eyes of 2 patrol officers, he had been no more than a suspect, a stereotype behind the wheel of a nice car. Darren didn't waste time. His fingers moved across the keyboard with calm purpose, the kind born not from rage, but from institutional knowledge. He knew where to send the footage, how to annotate every interaction for internal review, what statutes were violated, and which clauses in the Civil Rights Act applied. And by the time the city's internal affairs inbox pinged at 9:07 a.m., it was already accompanied by parallel submissions to DHS Legal Counsel, the Office of the Inspector General, the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, and the Federal Police Oversight Board, each file watermarked, encrypted, and tracked. By noon, the gears were already turning. His inbox lit up with official replies ranging from cautious acknowledgments to direct requests for meetings. But what Darren hadn't anticipated was how fast the footage would leak. It wasn't him. He played everything by the book, but someone inside. One of the offices clearly understood the power of the visual narrative. The calm black man in a blazer, surrounded by patrol cars, calmly producing a federal badge. As to officers froze on camera, realizing their careers were on the line. The video was online by late afternoon, and within hours, it was viral. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, even TikTok. Every platform carried versions of the footage under hashtags like #ProfiledTheWrong1, #Homeland Security, while black, and #Darren Cole. Influencers reacted. Civil rights attorneys reposted. News anchors dissected every second. Local news led with "Federal Agent Profiled During Traffic Stop," "Race or Routine." National outlets followed with sharper headlines. Homeland Security officials searched without cause, and another case of driving while black, but this time, the system bit back. Darren watched it all from his office window, eyes Steady, heart heavy, not from fame, but from familiarity. Because while the world was shocked, he was simply tired. Tired that even now, after years of service, his credibility only mattered because it was caught on tape. That evening, the mayor of Atlanta held a press conference in front of City Hall, flanked by a visibly uncomfortable chief of police, both of them expressing regret, promising an independent review and renewed commitment to justice. But Darren knew those words, had helped write them for other cities during similar moments of crisis. He wanted more. So, he requested a formal sit-down not with the officers, not with PR staff, but with the top brass, the mayor, the police commissioner, the head of city oversight. His request came not as a suggestion, but a requirement. He offered them a meeting, but not a passive one. He came armed with a 45-page policy report titled Bias, Enforcement, and the Breakdown of Protocol, a case for systemic reform, citing data from the last 7 years of police stops by demographic, mapped against local training standards, arrest-to-charge ratios, and outcomes by race. It wasn't just a protest, it was a plan. And when they sat across from him in a closed-door meeting, expecting anger, they got statistics, charts, testimonies, and a warning. If I, with my badge, my clearances, and my position, am subject to this, what happens to a 19-year-old with no phone, no lawyer, and no name in the system? Darren laid out a full restructure. Mandatory quarterly bias training for all officers. Community evaluation panels with subpoena power, an updated use of force escalation matrix tied to real-time data tracking, and, most controversially, a public-facing officer accountability dashboard. There was resistance at first talk of budgets, union pushback, optics, but Darren shut it down. You don't have a budget problem, he said. You have a credibility problem, the commissioner bristled. The mayor nodded slowly. The room shifted. Over the next week, the city council met under pressure from both public outrage and internal review. And Darren found himself advising an emergency task force, rewriting policy on the fly, giving interviews not as a victim but as a reform architect. CNN requested a segment, NPR, called, but he didn't go on to tell his story, he went on to tell everyone's, because Darren understood. Something the headlines never quite captured. This wasn't a single bad stop. It was a symptom of a deeper disease. And the only cure was exposure, accountability, and relentless reform. What the officers didn't expect that day was not just that Darren Cole had authority, it was that he had influence, and the kind of mind that didn't just demand justice, but knew exactly how to build systems that made it impossible to ignore. As the city moved toward implementing his recommendations, other cities reached out. His report circulated across agencies. DHS announced new internal protocols inspired by the incident. Darren didn't smile. He didn't celebrate. He simply kept working because it was never about revenge. It was about rebuilding a system that had long been broken, one policy at a time. Weeks after the stop that had quietly ignited a fire across the country, Darren Cole sat alone in the green room of a major network studio in New York City, the low hum of overhead lights barely registering as he rehearsed in his mind not his talking points, but his mission to turn a personal violation into a public reckoning, to ensure that the moment he became a national name would be a lever for collective awareness, not just personal vindication. And when the producer gave him the cue, and he walked calmly onto the set of the evening broadcast, suit pressed, voice steady, presence composed. It wasn't celebrity he wore, but purpose. His eyes didn't seek applause, only understanding. The anchor began softly, "Your agent, Darren Cole, Homeland Security. But the world first met you during a traffic stop." Darren didn't flinch. "The world met me," he said, "because 2 officers saw a black man in an SUV, not a federal agent. And that's the point." From that moment, he wasn't just speaking, he was commanding the conversation, not with blame, but with truth. He described the stop not in anger, but with clarity, how he was pulled over for nothing, how they searched his vehicle illegally, how their demeanor changed the moment they realized who he was, not because of what he did wrong, but because of who they assumed he was. Then, with unshakable calm, he looked into the camera and said the words that would echo across the country. "I didn't use my badge to flex power. I used it to expose abuse. Because if they treated me this way knowing nothing about me, imagine how many others they've silenced. The interview aired to millions, and the effect was immediate. Editorials poured out from every corner, conservative and progressive debating what Darren represented. Some saw him as proof that the system worked when good people stood up, others as a symbol that it was still failing even its most credentialed citizens. But for Darren, it was never about either side. It was about impact. And impact, he knew, required policy, not platitudes. So when the city's independent review released its findings citing systemic issues in traffic stop procedures, racial bias in discretionary searches, and inconsistent officer training, Darren didn't issue a victory statement. He called for deeper reform. The 2 officers involved were suspended without pay, their conduct deemed gross negligence and violation of public trust. And though they attempted appeals, internal review upheld the decision. Meanwhile, Darren's report became mandatory reading within city council circles, then state agencies, and eventually federal law enforcement departments. He was invited to Washington, D.C., not for hearings, but for collaboration, meeting with DOJ officials, civil rights leaders, police unions, even young community activists, to draft a new interagency protocol called the CRED Act: Community Rights, Equity, and De-escalation, a bipartisan framework that emphasized transparency, mandatory body cam footage release, and third-party oversight boards in all departments receiving federal funding. Darren worked late into the nights, sometimes on Zoom calls with precinct commanders from other states, sometimes quietly at his desk, rewriting outdated DHS guidelines with a lens of community dignity. But the public noticed something else too. Darren never made it about himself. He refused to sign a book deal, turned down paid speaking engagements, declined security contracts that wanted to use his face on a brand. His message was consistent. This isn't my story, it's ours. At schools, he spoke with students. At churches, he listened to elders. At protests, he stood without fanfare, holding signs like anyone else. And in every conversation, he asked the same question. What would justice look like to you? Meanwhile, his own agency began implementing his reforms, rolling out cultural literacy training and requiring bias evaluations during officer reviews. Within a year, departments across the country adopted pieces of his Newark, Sacramento, Charlotte, Tulsa each. And back in the city where it all began, the mayor invited him to lead a public town hall on policing reform. The same room that once held apologies now held possibilities. And as he stood at the podium, looking out at officers, civilians, young people, skeptics, and supporters, he told them, justice isn't a destination, it's a habit. One we have to practice every day, in every stop, every call, every uniform. He left the stage not to applause, but to a standing silence and audience, too moved for claps, giving reverence instead. But what truly marked the shift came quietly. Weeks later, a letter handwritten from a woman in Chicago whose son had been stopped 6 times in 2 years. Because of you, it read, he now knows it wasn't his fault. And now they wear cameras. And now they check their tone. And now my son walks with his head up. Darren folded that letter, kept it in his wallet, and carried it into every meeting after. Not as proof of victory, but as a reminder of responsibility. Because change, he believed, wasn't measured in laws passed, but in dignity restored. And in a country still struggling with the weight of its own conscience, Darren Coleman, once humiliated on the side of a road, became the face of what justice could look like when humility met courage and policy met purpose. Not for fame, not for revenge, but so that someday no one would need a badge to be treated with basic respect.